Well, welcome to Lobbyists for Citizens podcast. We have a very special guest today. Let's bring our guest on.
Hello,
And
Brian.
hello, John. We have Commissioner John Hamercheck, who has graciously agreed to join us for this podcast. And subject matter for the podcast is the issue one, the election on August 8th. I believe I'm correct on that. And this issue is dealing with the changing of the ability to make changes to the amendments to the state of Ohio Constitution. So, John, do you want to mention to the people, what currently is happening with how do we change the state of Ohio Constitution? How does that happen right now?
Well, our legislature can propose a change, and then it's voted on by the people, and that's a 50+1 threshold for passage, or it can be by ballot initiative. And that ballot initiative is in the form of, I believe it's only half of the counties would need to be represented, with 10% of any one of those half of the counties being looked at. And it actually turns a large portion of Ohio into flyover counties. And we've all heard of flyover country. Well, there's a lot of counties that are going to be completely bypassed. And the threat is, if I could just go right into that, we've got
Yeah.
a lot of professional marketing companies that know exactly how to manipulate the voters, because they look at who's actually going to be voting that day, and that's who they target. And a 50+1 threshold is a pretty easy mark to make.
So when you say ballot initiative, that's the will of the people. They'll create an amendment, and that the people will sign on to say that they do want to make this change. And is that what a ballot initiative is? Is that by the people as opposed to the legislators, where the legislators will run it?
I would say you're being a purist, and I know we've talked about a lot of us who try to do things the right way. We also suffer from being just a little naive.
Yes.
And when you say the will of the people, it's a little bit like marketing. What toy are you going to buy for your kid at Christmas? We get bombarded with commercials. What insurance company are you going to go with? You get bombarded by commercials and clever marketing campaigns. It literally has turned into politics of popularity and not education. And the 50+1 threshold is now being abused by professional organizations that are really hyper diligent at misleading language and omissions. They're expert at it now.
But when I say the ballot initiative, the will of the people, though, that a special interest group can create whatever amendment they want, but they have to get a petition signed by, I think it's 10% of the voters that voted in for the governor in the previous election. So it may be not the people that are writing it, but the people have to sign the petitions. Is that not correct?
It is correct, but it also is only half of the counties. Only 44 of the 88 would need to be reflected in that.
I see.
And
So that's why you say they target, specific counties where they know the counties that favor their line of thought. Okay, so as I understand it, there is a date that there's some early voting that can go on. The actual election is August 8th. Is that correct? And
I believe so, yes.
And I think the early voting is July 11th. So anyone in Lake County that wants to do some early voting can go to the Board of Elections, which is in the downtown administration building in downtown Painesville, and they can do early voting at that time.
Yes, that's early in-person voting, or they can do the traditional paper ballot, have it mailed out to them, or they can stop by Board of Elections and pick up their paper ballot if they're there in person.
So, Commissioner, why the need for this amendment change from the 50+1 to the 60% threshold? There is a reason for it, right? And it's because
Yeah,
of the proposed amendment on the November ballot. Is that correct?
I would not attach protecting our Constitution to any one initiative or
Mm-hmm.
issue. But
Mm-hmm.
I would say, as I had mentioned earlier in our conversation, professional marketing companies, uh, groups that represent special interests, have figured out how to manipulate um, our election process. The threshold of 50 plus one is very easy because it's only 50% of those who actually are going to vote that day. It's
That's
not
correct.
50% of the people in the state of Ohio. And
Right.
again, that's something that part of the education process. It's not getting out there. This has nothing to do, and then also there's, I'll throw this out there. There's a lot of fear mongering. This has nothing to do with gerrymandering, manipulation. What this has to do is a fair representation. If we, the people, are going to be living under a constitution, it should be one that is at least consented to by the people of the state. And when half of the counties can be completely ignored, that's
I
very
see.
troubling. And that's really what it's coming down to.
I see. So you could have a special interest group, for example, that wants to eliminate the Second Amendment rights in the state of Ohio through a constitutional amendment, right? Or whatever special interest group, whether it's the abortion or whatever it is, that that could come down the pike. And if we don't go from 50 plus one to 60%, it's much easier to change that.
To your point, using your examples, I believe the Second Amendment, you're going to find that would be federally protected.
Mm-hmm.
But the abortion issue has now been referred to as a state issue. So that would be a fair example to be looked at as how 50 plus 1% of the people voting could determine for all what the actual outcome would be.
Right. And I do have some statistics that that I found that there's not all of the states are not at 50%. The state of Ohio is one of a few states that have 50% plus one. There's many others that have much tougher restrictions, and some saying that you just can't amend the Constitution.
Agreed. And if I could get a little pun in there, Ohio is very liberal with our ability to amend. In fact, our Constitution has been amended 170 times.
170 times.
Yeah.
Wow.
And
Well,
things wind up in those amendments that should be legislative in nature. Casino gambling, for example, it's in the Constitution.
right. So why would there be a need for an amendment of gambling in our Constitution? You're right. It could be just a legislative matter, and they handle it. But what they're saying is we want to make sure once and for all, if we want to get gambling, in the state legalized, let's put and do it through the Constitution. Then we don't have to worry about it again, because if it's legislatively, somebody could reverse that ruling down the road.
For all practical purposes, yes, and it's actually less expensive to target the Constitution than it is to persuade the legislature. And I'll also throw this out there, it's actually less costly to manipulate, and I say manipulate, some people would say persuade
Mm-hmm.
voters to vote one way or the other because of, again, misleading information, omissions,
Mm-hmm.
and people vote for what they think they know.
Mm-hmm.
And some of these crafty marketing groups, they play on what people think they know. And that's how you get things passed.
So a constitution that was formed in 1851, I understand, with that had 6,000 words affirming our basic rights for property and freedom and liberty. Now is I think it's like 60,000 words, and it's been amended 151 times. I did not know that.
170.
This is 170 times. My goodness, my goodness. So do we? Can we say that Commissioner John Hamercheck is in favor of voting yes on issue one? Is that correct?
Yes. And my biggest reason for that is if there's going to be an amendment to our Constitution, whoever wants that amendment should be educating the public as to why and garnering support, not just tricking people into voting for something.
Correct.
Put the facts in front of the people. If you want to have the will of the people reflected, make sure you have an educated electorate out there and get them engaged rather than just voting for what's popular at the moment.
Yes, the other thing that concerns me, I've heard from the Board of Elections, it's estimated that there may only be 12 to 15% of the registered voters actually voting, on this special election, which is really disturbing. So you can have 12% of the population, deciding for Lake County whether or not to change the Constitution.
Well,
And,
to be completely clear, it's actually half of that plus one vote.
right,
If that's all that's coming out, think about it. It's even worse than that. As bad as it might sound on the face of it, it's twice as bad.
right, right. You're correct. It's 50% of those that vote. Do you have any other
Yes,
words of
it's
wisdom?
bad, isn't it?
Yeah.
This is-
Do you have any other words of wisdom, for us? Because what I'd like to do is I'd really like to, get this message out. We'll post it on Lobbyists for Citizens, and we'll get the message out to the people as the best we can. Because all the groups that I belong to and all the meetings they are concerned. They want to make sure that we get some very good voter turnout on this.
and that's important. And again, it might be worth mentioning. Earlier, you were telling me about the thresholds for other organizations.
Mhm.
It's one thing to say other states have a much higher threshold, but in common daily life, there were a couple that you were sharing. I think that's part of the education process. Do you mind sharing that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that's what was I saying here? The Yeah, 32 states do not allow any citizen-initiated groups to change their constitution. Another 9 states have the threshold at least 60%. Uh, to change the League of Women Voter bylaws, the Constitution, you need 66%. To change the Democrat bylaws, you need 60%. So, all of these other organizations have a much higher threshold, but the state of Ohio Constitution is 50 plus 1.
And
It's
if
way
you look
too
at,
easy.
there you go. And if you look at who's opposing issue one, the very same organizations that are saying you have to have a living document that could be changed with changing times are the ones who have the exact same or a more strict procedure to amend their own bylaws, which is their version of a constitution for their
Right,
organization.
right,
I
right.
just want
Right.
to make a little fine point there.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. I do appreciate it. And thank you so much for spending the time on this Sunday afternoon with me. I do appreciate it very much.